I'm Scott Wheeler. I have the pleasure of being the moderator for this first panel this morning that I hope will provide great stimulation for your thoughts about our current predicament. I also have the pleasure of sharing the stage with Pat Cadell, former Carter advisor, former McGovern advisor, and what I like to call one of the most decent and honest people in politics. And thank you. You might ask the question, we have a former Democrat here, not a former Democrat, a Democrat here. What could he possibly add to this? Well, I'll tell you. Here's a guy who loves his country, who is as patriotic as anyone I know, who recognizes American exceptionalism and knows that we have a real problem in the Democratic Party. We also have one of the most brightest minds on our side, David Horowitz, who's going to be able to fill in a lot of the gaps here. From my youngest days in journalism, I have relied heavily on David's research, his books, his analysis, and recognized it right off the bat as being some of the most brilliant and insightful information available anywhere. And I am just in awe of his accomplishments. What I want to pose to Pat and David here is the current predicament we face. What is the Democratic Party these days, and where did it go astray, and who is running it? Well, what better person to address that than the guy who wrote Shadow Party back in '06, which was essentially showing the confluence between huge Democratic money, or huge outside money from George Soros and several foundations and organizations that he funds, which, by the way, totals over 1,000 organizations inside the United States. That's what we're up against. And his marriage to the Democratic Party. And David, please address that.
Okay, I was hoping you were going to start with Pat, who knows the Democratic Party from the inside.
Which is really scary, by the way.
Which is really scary. I can remember when I was a radical being amazed around 1971, 72, when Tom Hayden and Jane Fonda and other revolutionaries, Jane Fonda, if you recall, had said at the University of Michigan that if Americans understood communism, they would go down on their knees and pray for it to come to the United States, and who collaborated with the North Vietnamese torturers of our men in arms in the Hanoi Hilton, who confided in her thinking she's an American, whatever her political beliefs. And she promptly turned around and gave her their Social Security numbers so they could be identified. And she promptly turned them over to their torturers, and they were tortured because of what she did. So I was dumbfounded when people started marching into the Democratic Party in 1971, and particularly in the McGovern campaign of 1972. I was, I guess, not Machiavellian enough to remain a leftist. For me, what we had always said, the Democratic Party is a party of the ruling class. But they did. They went into the Democratic Party. They changed the rule. And of course, they had Tom Hayden organized the demonstrations that killed the chances of Hubert Humphrey of being elected in 1968. And I remember that well, too, because Hayden came to me. I mean, he said there's going to be blood in the streets. And Their plan was to create bloodshed. And here, 2 or 3 years later, they're all becoming part of the Democratic Party. They went in, they changed the rules, and over the last 30 years, they gained control of the Congressional Party, and thanks to Soros, a lot more. Just to do it in a nutshell, what Soros did was he organized the campaign finance reform movement, financed it, even gave a lot of money to John McCain to push it, because what the campaign finance reform movement did is it deprived the party structure itself of soft money, which then went to 527s that Soros organized. It's not the technical aspects of this are not important, but in effect, Soros organized a shadow party into which something like $300 million went in the 2004 campaign, so that Kerry's message was really architected by Harold Ickes and people far to the left of Ickes, because they controlled the media message. And the ground war was controlled by the SEIU and other very radical unions. I still can't believe I saw this, but Glenn Beck had a clip of Andrew Stern, the head of these are public sector unions, saying in a speech, "Workers of the world unite." It's one thing for a conservative to drop that phrase without understanding its provenance, but of course it's the summary statement of the Communist Manifesto, and when somebody like Andy Stern says it, it has its original meaning. So what we see now is a party that, as I've described it, is composed, well, not everybody in the party, but is dominated by two wings of the party, the crooks and the communists. And they've elected a president who represents both wings of the party.
From a city that births both wings of the party. Let me give you just a little insight into what's going on, who these people are and what's going on. I wouldn't call them communists and crooks. I would call them crazies and crooks. From a personal viewpoint, I remember, one day it dawned on me recently, I thought, who are these people? And then I remembered, I knew all these people in college. I was there in I was at Harvard between 1968, fall 68 and spring of 72, and I remember my roommates and I, for fun, would go out to the SDS meetings, which were held in Lowell Lecture Hall, and most of our friends would go to watch the amusement. And because we were most of the time laughing at those people, and then nobody took them seriously, and then when we all had to go out in the world and make our way, they went and took over all the foundations in America and all the schools and education. And one day it dawned on me, I realized who these people are. They're people we would never let in the room seriously. They are one component of what's going on, but more sinister than that, and more concern to me, is what's happening with, look, our political system has been ripped with corruption for a long, long time. It's not new. Boss Tweed is well remembered in Democratic circles particularly, but we have reached a level of corruption and the money, and what happened is that the new wealth of the Democratic Party exposed itself, and George Soros, they have a plan. And this alliance that David mentioned between money, and I want to just take a moment to make you understand, because I will come back to this point, because it is also about your failure. They have four people, essentially four people, five, there's one couple. In 2004, George Soros, Peter Lewis, who's the head of the Progressive Insurance Company out of Cleveland, and Soros' best friend, they both have sons named Jonathan, Stephen Bing in L.A. is sometime a Hollywood producer who inherited a lot of money, and the Sandlers out of San Francisco from Golden West SNL that they sold. Together, 4 of them gave $75 million to a 527 called ACT, formed with the SEIU, which was called America Coming Together, what David talked about. And they were supplemented by millions of others. They raised almost $200 million for their separate campaign. When 04 failed, there was this very unhappy group of millionaires and billionaires, and they got together, led by George Soros, and they met and they formed something called the Democracy Alliance. There were 70 of them at the initial meeting. And then also there were Bill Moyers, which I was shocked to discover that Bill was there. Moyers was there, and they had 70 of them, and they went into a very secret meeting and agreed they would pool their money to move the cause. And what they would do is, first of all, you have to understand, these people believe they are the oppressed. They have said so. They feel disenfranchised. They feel that the conservatives are taking over the country because of the Heritage Foundation and other things. And I mean, without any regard to the fact that the mainstream media is essentially liberal, or that the foundation support, the foundation, it's unbelievable and it's legal what happens, the way this money moves about, the billions and billions of dollars that goes through all these organizations. Look at the organizational structure and you will understand what's happening in the country. You have the Tides Foundation, you have the Acorn, by the way. Let me just tell you one thing, and I can summarize a lot of this in this one thought. One of the projects, the Democracy Group, and these people pool their money and they're very entrepreneurial about it. One of their projects is called the Secretary of State Project. That project came after the 2000 election when they decided that Florida had been stolen. They decided that the key thing was to elect secretaries of state. One of the states, they've succeeded in helping direct the campaigns, because who runs for Secretary of State, right? In states, they've elected 7 people, Secretary of States, 5 of them associated with Acorn, including in Minnesota. Let me explain to you the impact. The reason that Al Franken sits in the United States Senate today is because the Secretary of State of Minnesota was an Acorn person who was supervising the counting of the ballots in that state, all right? These people mean business. Let me just say this. They mean business, and they are serious, and they believe, and here is the important point. I don't recognize them as Democrats. My party, the party I belong to, actually cares about people who are unemployed. You'll notice how this administration seems not to care at all about people who are unemployed, who are suffering and losing their homes. Well, it is because what we have built in this country is an elite society, a society essentially of effete elitist snobs who believe that they have, and they say this, that they have the right answer if only the American people are too dumb to understand what should be done, and they will do it for them. My question for you that I put on the table is simple. How is it that when the country is on the other side, if you look at all the polls, the movement of the polls, and Gallup and Rasmussen, everything I've been looking at, 2 to 1 people think 40% of the country says they're conservative, 20% liberal. It's the worst numbers in years. You look at the numbers on abortion, on social policy, on government responsibility on health care. In 2006, 69% of the people said health care for all Americans was essentially a government responsibility. Today, 47% say that. That's in 3 years. The movement is going all in the other direction, and yet they're winning. They are imposing things the country doesn't support. And you should ask yourself, they're winning because of people like you. And I'll get to that more, but don't kid yourself. They are like, for those of you who remember the movie The Terminator, they are intent on moving the country the way they want to move it. They have a president, they have a White House, which I call a combination between basically the crazies on the one end and the crooks on the other, led by Rahm Emanuel. You know, this is a president who got elected to change Washington. It's not change here, folks. But in any event, these people, to meet these people, they really believe, and by the way, they're not all conspiracy oriented. Soros, I have serious problems with. And, you know, and what I want the Democratic Party to do is I'm hoping that someday, and I know Scott's working on a project, on a film on this, which needs to be done, which is to tell Democrats, just the shorthand for it, meet your parents. Who owns the Democratic Party but Wall Street? Democrats. People who make their own money and just think that the peasants should support them, and they will give what the peasants need. If the Democratic Party met itself, and who owned it, it would be a different world. But they're not going to meet itself, but it's certainly not going to be the mainstream media who's going to tell them this. And so far, you people have failed to do anything to tell them. So I am left, me and the other, there are a lot of covert Democrats like me, who are in hiding. I'm so long gone with those people, I don't care. But I mean, but the point is that, but there's nothing to tell the ordinary people what's happening here.
Everybody remembers Van Jones, right? He was the, for short-lived, green job czar until Glenn Beck blew up many of his statements about being a communist, being a socialist. And what I want to ask David is, how does Jones get a job in this administration? What's the thinking behind this?
Van Jones reflects the inner thinking of the Obama administration. They wanted a communist to run the Green Jobs program. What you have to understand is, we did a little pamphlet on Barack Obama's Rules for Revolution. If you read that, you'll understand it immediately. It's all about power. I have a respectful disagreement with Pat. These people are only crazy from the point of view of somebody who's not an ideologue. But from the point of view of being an ideologue, they know exactly what they're doing, and they're very rational about it. The problem of the left is that the future, which was tried in Russia, was horrible. And the left had this albatross on its back during the Cold War because it had to defend the Soviet Union, which it did. The hero of the fall of the Berlin Wall for all good progressives is Gorbachev. So a guy who was a leftist at the time, Saul Alinsky, was somebody that we didn't like when we were the radicals, because his idea was that you don't go out and say you want a revolution, and you don't go out and say bring the curse word down and up against the wall and so forth, all of the slogans that we used to like, because that telegraphs what you want to do. And people just will say, dismiss you, as Pat Cadell did when he was a good Democrat back then. So what Alinsky said is, first of all, you have to bore from within. You have to infiltrate the institutions. And he made an alliance with Bobby Kennedy and got inside the poverty program of the Great Society, and that's when the government funding of communism began. It amazes me, people say, oh my God, Acorn got $53 million from the federal government starting in 1994. Well, that's the year that the Republicans took control of the House and funded Acorn.
The brain-dead party.
Although, exactly. So what Alinsky said is, you don't tell people where you're going. You don't use words that show it. You don't. That book, his book Rules for Radicals, was originally called Rules for Revolution. You conceal your agendas. You pretend to be for peace, for justice, for all the kind of things that people, for the 47 million uninsured, as my favorite spokesperson, Ann Coulter, in her, this is the really good book she wrote, guilty. She has a chapter, said the motto of liberals, speak loudly and carry a small victim. So you pick the victim, you're just doing it for the little guy. Alinsky would have these training sessions, and Alinsky is he's the godfather of this left and of this Democratic Party. And in the training sessions, he would ask his trainees, Obama came a little later, but the people that followed Alinsky taught him the same thing. Why are you here? Why are you a community organizer? And they would say to help the poor, to create peace in the world, to feed the homeless. And Alinsky would scream at them and say, no, you're here for power, to get power. And he would say you have to get rid of the do-gooders in the movement. This is all about power. And so lying, and the entire book that he wrote is about lying. It's about lying to people to conceal your agendas. I mean, if you want to understand Barack Obama and what's happened to the Democratic Party, that's it.
Can I tell an insight to your book when you wrote about Alinsky, which I didn't know, that explains Chicago too? It's so important. This is the most important fact. Well, Alinsky, when he was a graduate student, became enamored with the Capone mob. Decided they were a wonderful model, and he befriended Frank Nitti, who was the Capone enforcer. Capone was off in Alcatraz. Nitti was running the Chicago operation, the mob. And he spent several years intimately with him, learning how the Chicago mob operated. Chicago is a juxtaposition between the Democratic Party, the mob. The only other place I can think of is New Jersey, where it literally plays a role, and it's both an ideologically supports, but it is the mob. It's Al Capone. And those tactics, if you wonder how Chicago works, and now we have Chicago gone national, you start seeing how things work. And I didn't know this, but Alinsky was the great promoter of this. Loved the Capone mob. It's a great story.
Frank Nitti was the guy that Kevin Costner threw off the building. He was the hitman. He's the guy who killed Sean Connery, if you've seen the movie. He said, he's my teacher.
He said, he's my teacher. The professor.
So, but that's why I say crooks and communists. I mean, it's the Chicago machine. See, if you're a conservative, you go about thinking how to build things. You are the builders and the creators. If you are on the left, you are the destroyers. So I can remember when I was a radical, there was a little town near Berkeley, it's where I was a radical, called Emeryville. And there was a tax dodge or shelter. So it was just industrial. There were only 900 people living there. So when I heard that, I said, we can take that over. That's the way I thought. Unfortunately, from my point of view then, but fortunately for the country, I mean, that left was actually, it was the kind of left you want. We were very open. We said what our agendas were. And everybody was high, so they didn't, they couldn't even manage taking over a town with 900 people. What's happened to the left is it's gotten very serious. It's gone back to its communist roots. My mother was a Democrat. My family of communists never used the word communist. They were progressives. And we, as a new left, we had contempt for them. For our parents, because we felt that they were appeasing, and they didn't have the cojones to stand up and say, we're revolutionaries and we want a revolution, which is what Jerry Rubin did say before the House Un-American Activities Committee. It was great theater. It's why people kind of enjoyed the 60s. Yeah. But that's gone. These people will tell you, what they tell you is a lie. They will tell you that they're progressives. They will do everything. If you just ran Obama's speeches on every issue, you will see he lied through the entire campaign, and not the way, politicians generally do. You have to shade things. It's not spin, it's a lie. So that's what we're up against. I have good news, but I'm going to save that for the next round.